future. The session today will assess the role of business in standing up for human rights defenders, why they should stand up, and also will bring in examples of how businesses have done or can do that. And to discuss that, we have a really strong panel today. We've got Ms. Mary Lawler, who's the special reporter on the situation of human rights defenders, Professor Anita Ramasastry, member, UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Cynthia Verico, Regional Representative, Southeast Asia Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, His Excellency Mr. Stefan Hallström, Ambassador, Embassy of Sweden in Thailand, Sutri Vanasuri, researcher in human rights defenders. She's also an independent commissioner for human rights. Dr. Vora Suk, who's the Mekong campaign coordinator, business and human rights advocacy, Earth Rights International. Will Anderson, Vice President, Global Social and Environmental Sustainability, representing Adidas. And we have Bennett Freeman, who is the principal at Bennett Freeman Associates. Mary, I'm going to start with you. Thank you very much for joining us. We know that this is really early morning for you, so thank you for making the time and the effort. We're delighted to have you with us, and congratulations on this new mandate. You've recently joined the mandate. What do you think are the key challenges for human rights defenders in Asia and the Pacific region, particularly in the context of businesses? Over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much for having me. Just generally, I think the challenges facing human rights defenders are things like intimidation, threats, unfair trials, arrest, detention, torture, the kind of attacks that they face, which can lead in some cases to extrajudicial execution. And also the obstacles put in their way, like legislation that seeks to prevent them doing their legitimate work. When it comes to business and human rights, this is going to be one of the key priorities for the mandate, because it's an issue that needs focus on not only on its own, but also because it overlaps with other priorities of mine, which will be human rights defenders working in isolated and remote areas, human rights defenders focusing on corruption, human rights defenders at high risk of being killed, such as women human rights defenders or Indigenous human rights defenders or LGBTI defenders. And clearly, this includes human rights defenders all over Asia. But if you look at the Philippines, for example, last year there were about 43 human rights defenders working on different areas that were killed. And globally, there was a documented record of over 300 human rights defenders, and 85% of those had received threats beforehand. So there is a pattern where it escalates from online to physical attack, and then then sometimes they're killed. And 40% of those were working in Indigenous and land environmental rights, and 13% of them were women. So I've been talking to human rights defenders in the region ever since I took up the mandate. And the challenges that I've outlined are basically the ones that they're facing. And now we have as you said earlier, how do they stay safe when so much of what they're doing is online, and whether there are issues around digital security or physical security, because working from home means increased vulnerability for some human rights defenders, that they can't move around and are stuck in the same place for weeks or months. And as I said, women human rights defenders face the same risks as their male counterparts, and together with LGBTI defenders are of course targeted for who they are as well as what they do, and so are additionally vulnerable, with the added risk of defying cultural norms. And meanwhile, business projects are often going ahead. In many cases, they've been deemed to be essential industry. So you have a situation where businesses are pushing ahead with some mega projects, while human rights defenders are stuck at home, isolating for health reasons and unable to exercise their right to freedom of association and assembly in order to protest, and often correctly for the common good. So finding ways to advocate and organize online securely are also becoming a big challenge now. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. I think you, really did help us set up sort of the context very well. We've also received a letter, given what's going on in Asia, we've also received a letter, to the organizers of the UN Forum on how defenders are being targeted in certain countries. And Anita, I want to bring in you here because you've been developing this guidance for states and businesses on actions to safeguard and support human rights defenders, particularly in line with the UNGPs. And I'm aware that you've consulted, you've organized regional consultations to seek inputs from various stakeholders. I did mention that this letter that we've received from defenders and civil society organizations in Thailand, calling for the organizers also to ensure that the voices of the defenders are heard. Did you have any similar experiences in the other regional consultations that you organized for the guidance? And of course, also if you could share some light on some of the key findings from the guidance. Thanks,
Great.
Anita, over to you.
Thanks so much, Harpreet, and thank you. And it's just an honor to follow after Mary. Welcome and congratulate her on her mandate. And I have to say that I'm speaking from a point of view where I'm grateful to the defenders who have shared their experiences with the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. But we're trying, and again, in terms of the defenders who shared and wrote to you and to the organizers and to the working group, thank you for sharing your perspective on these issues. Because again, as I'm going to share, the reason that the working group decided to issue, and we'll be presenting this to the Human Rights Council in a few weeks, guidance which says what are the expectations for states, for business, and for civil society to deal with the issue that Mary has discussed, which are the threats to and risks to human rights defenders that are speaking up and speaking out on so many issues. And the issue or the challenge that we have in the letter that was sent to us from defender organizations is essentially that we're not seeing an improvement, right? That the situation continues to be one that is so grave and so serious that despite these efforts and despite people speaking out, and we're going to hear from Bill Anderson and from Bennett Freeman later, despite these efforts, right, we are not seeing the progress that we really need. So let me just start by saying that the working group engages in country missions around the world. We've been to Thailand, we've engaged with the Thai government around the National Action Plan, and we've spoken out about issues and concerns around human rights defenders in Thailand, and will continue to do so, and are grateful for the fact that defenders engage with us. But Thailand is not unique. As we look around the world, and we look at Latin America, we look in Africa, we look in North America, we see continuing challenges. And the challenges I'm going to speak to, and the reason that we have guidance are to say, what are expectations for companies, not only in terms of respect for human rights under the guiding principles on business and human rights, but respect for human rights defenders. And that's a much more specific and important issue. So I want to make 2 points about companies here, and the guidance will delve into this more, which is that what we see whenever we go on country visits or we speak to defenders is the following: that defenders continue to be painted as people who are agitators or who are enemies, as opposed to people who are on the ground and who speak for their communities and who understand what the challenges are in terms of human rights issues and impacts from business activity. So this really relates back to the fact that businesses need to use the guiding principles more generally to consult with stakeholders and with human rights defenders in particular. And when they fail to do that and there's corresponding conflict that ensues, it is not the defender that is the problem. It is the business that has failed to consult and to really understand what the impacts are that human rights defenders may be trying to educate the company about. So that's a really larger issue, which is just consultation, and seeing defenders as partners is the starting point, and we really emphasize that. But the second point I want to make, and I really look forward to Bill's intervention on this, which is that there are any number of companies in the world of international trade, investments, supply chains, value chains, extractive industries. But one of the issues that we want to emphasize is that when we ask business to speak up and to deal with risks to human rights defenders, that doesn't mean that we're immediately pointing the finger at a specific company. What companies need to understand with the UN guiding principles is that there's an ecosystem, and that if a business is engaged in an activity, whether it's sourcing, from a factory in a particular country, whether it's building a dam in a particular place, that there are going to be many other parties involved in that business activity. That can be subcontractors, that can be suppliers, that can be security forces, that can be police, that can be local government, it can be national government. So what we're saying is that human rights defenders face risks from business activity. We don't know ahead of time who is going to cause the risk or the harm to the defender, but the issue is that every business that's engaged in activity needs to be aware that their engagement in economic activity heightens the risk to defenders. And again, because of that, we really ask businesses, especially those that are transnational and involved at the largest of level with leverage, to engage in human rights due diligence that anticipates the risks to defenders. When they go into a country, or when they source, or when they're engaged in activity, to say, okay, we know that this may create a risk for people who are standing up for human rights, so we need to actually engage in impact assessments that thinks about risks to those leaders. And we need to create strategies for mitigation and protocols that will ensure their safety because of the work they're doing, which is important for everyone. And so that's the key part of the guidance that we're issuing, which is saying, what do the guiding principles say about human rights due diligence and consultation as it relates to defenders? And similarly, access to remedy. And I'm just going to step back and say the guidance also speaks to states. In addition to states' duty to protect defenders more generally, states also need to create leverage, or use their leverage, and create situations where the expectation of their businesses when they go abroad is that there is respect for those defenders. So we need both states to act and companies to act. And I want to really say now, as we've heard from and we'll hear from defenders today, is just that at the moment, we haven't done enough. And Harpreet, when we get back to the second round of, I think, discussion, I'll talk about our particular concern around the use of the judicial system to silence and intimidate defenders around strategic litigation against public participation. And this is a particular concern, and we have particular ideas as to how we can move forward there. So thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Anita, and thank you for bringing in, particularly looking at human rights defenders in the human rights due diligence, because it's important that companies and the businesses anticipate the human rights risk for the defenders when they engage in economic activity. I think due diligence has been sort of one common thread across the various sessions of the forum, and I'm glad that we're bringing in this here also. Cynthia, let me move on to you next. From the you've been here in the region, and from the perspective of OHCHR's work in the region, what do you think are the key protection concerns that the human rights defenders face as a result of the business practices? Could you also highlight some of the main obligations of businesses to uphold and protect the human rights, from a normative perspectives? Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Harpreet, and hello to all of those who are online with us today. It's a pleasure to be here, and OHCHR is happy to partner on this session at the forum. I'd like to focus my points today on specific protection challenges faced by environmental human rights defenders in Southeast Asia, which ranks consistently as one of the most deadly regions in the world for this group of defenders. This is linked largely due to a growing quest for exploitation of natural resources, and is turning land and environmental issues into complex human rights challenges. Too often, we see that there are reports of local communities that attempt to protect their rights and end up as targets of threats, intimidation, and violent acts by companies, security firms, paramilitary groups, and local politicians. This in turn has led to a dramatic increase in such attacks against environmental defenders, as Mary had pointed out, who work in support of affected communities and seek to expose crimes and violations by those involved in corruption, violence, land grabbing, and environmental destruction. Many are ordinary people who seek to protect their families and their communities, and may not actually necessarily self-identify as environmental defenders. The threats and human rights violations experienced by this group range from harassment, intimidation, threats against their family, illegal surveillance and travel bans. We see that access to water is cut, to food, livelihoods, and sadly also arrests, detention, abductions, disappearances, and even murder. Environmental defenders also routinely face judicial harassment, as Anita has pointed out, a method that is used in the region frequently to silence activists. Repressive laws are used to criminalize their work, and cases are filed with fraudulent or trumped-up charges, often accusing them of defamation, trespassing, tax evasion, and treason. Environmental defenders are often kept in long periods of pretrial detention. They are denied often free trial and can be tortured and ill-treated, often facing disproportionately long prison sentences. Governments and businesses are increasingly also using inflammatory language to stigmatize and defame human rights defenders and community activists. Women and Indigenous environmental defenders are amongst the most vulnerable and face specific and additional challenges in the work that they do. On the second part of your question, in addition to the UN guiding principles, the existing normative framework includes ample guidance on how businesses can and should stand up for the rights of environmental defenders. I'd like to just briefly recall policy documents such as the 16 Framework Principles on Human Rights and the Environment, which was released in 2018, and also, of course, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which affirms that they must be consistently consulted from the inception of the project to its implementation, and free and informed consent must be obtained prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands, a requirement which unfortunately routinely is overlooked or manipulated by businesses as they seek to clear the way for the implementation of their project. Thank you.
Read, I'm afraid you're mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Cynthia. And in here, I'm going to bring the ambassador here. Ambassador, we know that you've been in the region for nearly 5 years, and we're aware that human rights defenders continue to be one of the priorities of the government of Sweden. Would you be able to share some of your observations in the region, particularly on the state of human rights defenders, and you will also mention some of the support that you've provided through the government of Sweden? Over to you.
I've spent, as I said, 5 years as Swedish ambassador to Thailand, Myanmar, and the OPDR. And during these years, I've met so many brave, knowledgeable, dedicated human rights defenders in the region. And they are huge assets in any society, should be seen as partners, as Anita Ramasastri previously said. They give voice to their communities, raise very legitimate concern, often related to environment. They strive for dialogue, which is the way to move societies forward in a peaceful, democratic way. And that has been a key to success in my own country, not least the social dialogue with trade unions, green movements, women's movement. But then in parallel, I have unfortunately seen so many of these human rights defenders here in the Asia-Pacific region being harassed and persecuted. In such a stark contrast to what is said in all possible UN documents, including the guiding principles. Particular challenges are, as we know, faced by women, by defenders advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples and communities living in rural and remote areas, and the urban poor like migrant workers. Honestly, I've often asked myself, would I have dared to do what they have done if I'd been in their position? It's time to change, and it's time to say enough is enough. Business and human rights, there is no trade-off between the two. International companies need to comply in order to remain competitive, to keep customer confidence, and to be attractive employers. The Swedish government is supporting the development of national action plans in the region. Here in Thailand, we gave the recommendation in the UPR process 2016, which was accepted by the government of Thailand. We have supported the process through UNDP, and this program is now supported by the European Union as well. And now implementation is key, here and everywhere. I've many times congratulated Thailand, we'll do it again, for the main achievement to become the first country in Asia to adopt a national action plan. But then, of course, we must remember that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The credibility of the national action plans is at stake if and when human rights defenders, often women, continue to be threatened and when their rights are violated. Many examples are given in the open letter to the organizers of this forum, and we have the slapped cases in particular. The growing number of such cases should be of great concern to all of us. They add to the climate of fear among human rights defenders. Often women are targeted, often these harassments are devastating for whole families, and this simply needs to stop.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for bringing in this important point about the national action plans. And we've seen, particularly in the last, I would say, 18 months to sort of 2 years, that there's been a lot of momentum in the region to develop the national action plans. But does the national action plan, or has the national action plans really changed the situation for the defenders on the ground? And what needs to be done to make sure that the defenders, the defenders are protected, and the priorities that the governments identify are also implemented in letter and spirit? And to bring reflections on that, I would like to bring Vora and Suturi, the two defenders on the panel. Vora, what do you see as the key challenges faced by defenders in the region? Do you see any pattern in the way that they're targeted? Do you see any commonalities or any trends sort of within the region? And Suturi, I would also want you to sort of come in after Vora, but really sort of talking about the strategic lawsuits against public participation. You've recently been acquitted from one, and then we've seen that in the region. In fact, more globally, we see that to silence or harass civil society organizations and defenders, the slap cases are being used very often. Drew, also share your experience on the same. Vora first, and then Suturi.
Thanks, Harpreet, and thanks to the organizer for the opportunity to speak at this virtual forum. I will talk particularly about the experience of Southeast Asia per se. Human rights defenders, or in our language, we call them earth rights defenders, those advocates, trainers, and community leaders who protect resources and their land against corporate abuse, basically. The situation of earth rights defenders in the Southeast Asian regions, they are experiencing intimidation, imprisonment, even criminalization and other threats. In the area of business and human rights advocacy that I particularly have a strong interest, and also the interest of Earth Rights International engaging in the region, we found and witnessed the patterns of threats and attacks against human rights defenders, and they are most frequently connected to mining projects, oil and gas sector development, and also agribusiness, logging, deforestation, hydropower, and large-scale infrastructure projects, and are often carried out and sadly condoned by the state actors and vested business interests. Across Southeast Asia, where Earth Rights International work and engaging in, we have recognized a complex pattern of business misconduct, which have included discrete decisions made at the closed door that impacting our communities, absence of responsibility and accountability, inappropriate compensation, and poor public participation is the root cause of everything, as well as the lack of compensation and responsibility to provide remedies. The case that I would like to talk about and bring to attention as here is the case of, for example, in Myanmar, 33 farmers near the Tilawa Special Economic Zone. This is one of the promising SEC development in Myanmar and one of the very first case that everyone is excited about. But the case of these 33 farmers who defending their lands and natural resources and continue to farm on their lands, and they face illegal attempts on them, and they fighting against it until now. The case actually draw attention to the issue of trespassing, the use of this lawsuit against the farmers. The situation of threats, criminalization and violence against human rights defenders actually is intense, and the races continue to grow. Such as the case that we're going to hear from Khun Sutari based on her experience, based on the Thamasak case. Another case that I would like to draw attention to is the case of Ban Hang women rights defenders who fight against the corporate abuse, and those coal mining company in Lampang province, which is not far from Chiang Mai, where I'm based now. They're protecting their land and natural resources against the coal mining company. But what they are facing now is various forms of intimidations, including physical surveillance by unidentified men, harassment, threats of death, and enforced disappearance. These are identified, and these are the worrying trends. The other issue that I would like to draw attention on is the increasing use of strategic litigation against public participation that Anita has mentioned, and this is a serious issue in the region right now. Several slap lawsuits have filed against the Indigenous rights defenders who are protecting their land and natural resources, such as the case of Omgoi Mining Company. This is a coal mining company in one of the districts in Chiang Mai province in Thailand. And other cases, such as the reporter and the journalists who report on the issue, such as mining, waste, and pollution in the case of Thai Tahi region in Myanmar. And this journalist and reporter has filed a lawsuit, like slap lawsuit against. This is mainly to stop the activism, the efforts that the communities would like to put out. Several issues that I have mentioned here has drawn attention to the critical need to protect the human rights defenders. The other issue that I would like to draw upon is the case of transnational litigation filed by the woman from Cambodia against Thai company who operate in terms of sugar plantation in Cambodia. This is one of the first lawsuit filed in Thai court, and as a civil society, we are excited to see this kind of transnational litigation filed in order to seek justice and remedies across jurisdiction. The Cambodian woman rights defender filed a lawsuit against one of the leading sugar company who supplied sugar to also the leading soda giant. According to, this is not Chantal Hauru, so I won't talk about any name in particular. But she represented 3,000 impacted communities in Cambodia to file the first class action lawsuit in Thailand and raise the issue of land grabbing, intimidation, and harassment that she's been facing. After coming out to speak about the corporate abuse regarding land grabbing, she was still intimidated, thrown to jail, and these are serious issues that we heard on even daily basis in Southeast Asia case. So the reason I talk about all these cases because I would like to raise the important message here that it's really hard to find a good example or the practice of any company that I would label it as a good practice in the sense of enhancing public participation with the impacted communities, or even come up with a scheme or zero tolerance to retaliation policy per se. So only through litigation and legal approach that we, basically a rights international, has been engaging with, we are able to find a platform for negotiation and even dialogue between the impacted communities and those human rights defenders who are at risk. So I would like to stop here for others to take the floor.
Thanks, Flora. Khun Sutari?
Thank you very much for the organizer for having me today. And just want to correct that I am not any member of the Human Rights Commissioner. I work now as an independent researcher. So I would like to greet all the panelists and also the participants who are interested in this important issue. and are with us today. As you have mentioned, like Kun Wara has mentioned, that the business have long been also using this SLAPP lawsuit in order to intimidate human rights activists, journalists, and community members. In this case, in particular, the chicken farm company, Tamakase Farm Company, between the 2016 and 2020, the company has filed in total 38 lawsuits, including criminal and civil complaints against 22 individuals and 1 news agency. So the individuals are facing complaints include journalists, human rights activists, labor rights organizer, and the worker themselves. So this series of lawsuits, which is categorized by the UN Working Groups on Business and Human Rights as a SLAPP lawsuit, and the working group have called on the Thai government and the business to take a concrete action to stop this. But as you have seen, these lawsuits have been going on for the past 4 years, and the most recent one was filed in March this year. So actually, like in the middle of the pandemic. So we really have to ask ourselves, like, how long we are going to let this intimidation continue. So in my case, in particular, I'm facing 3 like legal complaints, all of them like criminal and civil defamation. For the civil defamation, I was asked to pay 5 million baht for tweeting or posting comments about the company on my Twitter. And for the criminal complaint, is the criminal defamation, and this beginning of this week, like the court just dismissed the charge against myself and Nanwin. Nanwin is one of the 14 migrant workers who have initiated a labor right abuse complaint against this company and has been facing with reprisal and retaliation for the past 4 years. So what are the effects of this SLAPP lawsuit? First thing I would like to address that this lawsuit actually are distracting and shifting the interest, the attention, and the resource from the structural and underlying problems. And in this case in particular, the underlying problem is the abusive and exploitative working condition against the migrant worker who decide to use the government's grievance mechanism in order to obtain and exercise their rights. But they are facing with this reprisal, and to note that there was no protection mechanism either from the government or from the National Human Rights Commission, which they use as a platform to demand their rights. So in this agricultural sector, there are still a lot of gaps in terms of the protection for the labor rights. And in addition to that, like the migrant worker in Thailand cannot set up their own trade union, for example. Under the Thai law, it is prohibited to set up their own trade union. And Thailand still has not ratified the ILO convention that will allow the right to association and collective bargaining for the workers. These are like the structural and underlying problems that we have not been discussing much because a lot of resource and attention has been shifted to this lawsuit. In addition to that, what I found is also a chilling effect on the freedom of expression, in particularly for reporting on human rights or labor right issue. As Kun Wara has rightly mentioned that because there is no, for example, this is not a shut and hub rule, a lot of people are afraid to mention the names of the company, even in just a normal conversation or a statement, because they are feared that they might also be the next person who are facing the persecution. So the several journalists and media agency that we are trying to reach out in order to raise the issue and the concern about this case have also fear that they themselves will face the lawsuit. So they decide not to publish the issue, for example. So these are the chilling effects that we have seen. And I would like to emphasize that this case is not an isolated case. I am one of the very few privileged activists that was able to share the story with the international platform, but there are so many other community rights activists, so many farmers and like migrant workers who are actually demanding their right and facing this retaliation, but they do not have the access to, for example, this platform, or they do not have the visible support that they should need. So this is something that I would like to ask as well for a relevant stakeholder to consider when we are discussing about the protection of human rights defender. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to move on to, we're going to move on to the recommendations and also, some of our demands and wants from different stakeholders to protect and respect defenders in the second round of the session. I do want to bring in Bill here. Bill, we know that Adidas has a policy on protecting human rights defenders, and we've taken multiple steps in public appearance in support of human rights defenders. Yet we see there are only a handful of companies who've raised their voices. What do you think really differentiates the leaders from the laggards, and why aren't enough businesses speaking up against attacks, intimidation and threats on human rights defenders? And I'm actually just also going to bring a question from the Q&A, which I think fits in very well here. And that's a reminder for everyone on the question and answer round. On the question answer toggle on your screen. If you're able to answer any questions, please go ahead and type in your answer as well, and we'll try to bring in and take in question and answers at the end. But if you see suitable and find opportunities, please do also try and respond to the questions within the question and answer toggle. Bill, there's also another question that has come up is about what are some of the minimum standards these policies or the mechanisms should aspire to, particularly in the context of how companies are operating. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Hopefully I'm live and visible. You're asking a question I ask myself: why are there not more peers attending these types of forums and being open and engaging on the real issues of the day? So that's something that there's no simple answer to. I can reflect a little bit, and I also want to take an opportunity maybe to touch on Anita's question regarding impact assessments, but I'll come to that in a moment. But I really want to reflect on the nature of corporates and the way people operate. They have their own cultures, these organizations. Some have foresight and are progressive. Others are reserved and perhaps even regressive. But some of the behaviors that I can hear from the defenders who previously spoke, really unacceptable, really unacceptable. But I think if you look at who leads and who's a laggard, is very much depending on the corporate structure, and also how those engagements have taken place as companies. Have you had collaborative processes? Are you actually in a point of conflict? Or do you have no policy or no approach, and no one that actually can manage that approach as an organization, as a company? And I think Bennett might share a little bit more about how to engage in the civic space and how important it is to be engaged in the civic space. If I reflect maybe on Anita's comment regarding the impact assessment, I give this as an example. Many years back now, 2010, I think it was 7 perhaps, we looked at entering into Myanmar as Myanmar opened up to provide access for manufacturing. And we spent 2 full years reviewing, conducting a human rights impact assessment and engaging with the available NGO community, the stakeholder community, to try and capture and understand exactly what it would mean as a corporate to be operating in that environment. And that included looking at things such as Cynthia mentioned about free prior consent for any land development and building out specific policies and expectations. So to me, again, effective impact assessments where as part of that process, brands or companies find the relevant stakeholder groups to engage with. They're really very vital. They're vital also if you take a longer term picture of things, because societies will always change. Things will never remain the same. And as those changes happen, you really need those points of engagement with people who may today not be called a human rights defender, but perhaps tomorrow they will be. So it's very, very important to build out those engagements. So I think the companies that are successful with these things, and there are very few, I'd say one of the biggest problems is that many are there. Some large corporates are very active, but perhaps they don't have the confidence to speak out, perhaps to join forums, as perhaps I would have. But what we've seen through the history of our own program, if I look into our own culture as an organization, the real benefit that we secured is because we're a German company, and in Germany there's a co-determination law. The co-determination law means that the executive board is overseen by a supervisory body, a supervisory board. Within our supervisory board is the Works Council, the employee representative body in Germany, and also trade unions. So from the very outset, trade unions and worker rights was a fundamental question that actively was raised by the supervisory board to our executive. And in turn, of course, we have developed over a course of 20 years, a very comprehensive program to address worker rights. And so, we have again been one of the companies, one of very few companies to generate a public policy on human rights defenders. And the history to that has come from 20 years of engagement, particularly around freedom of association and protection of the freedoms and rights for trade unions to form and be active within the supply chain. An additional benefit has been that there's been an independent channel, so we report to our executive board, but through our legal counsel. And the team that I manage always remained independent of, for our sourcing organization, and acted actually as a counterbalance in the, it's really a power game. Everyone understands that if you're in the human rights defender space, it's a power game. Where does that power lie? How do you influence the power? So our specialist department has always acted as a kind of bridging point between the power of the employer, the factories, and the workers and their rights and entitlement. So how organizations, where someone's a leader or a laggard, really depends fundamentally on the organizational structure and the cultures within the companies. Sometimes you can embed these efforts within a CSR department, a sustainability department, a government affairs person, but you have to effectively back and create the environment which will make for effective change and engagement. So that would be my quick takeaways. I can't really tell you, can't give you a list of the laggards and the leaders. That would be unfair. But I think really the critical concern I have on any forum that relates to Asia is there are too few leadership companies within the Asian realm. There's too few countries where you can say these 5 companies are leading in their field and are not entertaining legal action, silencing expression, affecting freedoms of association. So that's what I would summarize as the critical key points.
Thanks, Bill. And thank you for bringing the importance of the impact assessment and stakeholder engagement. I think those are really sort of the key points, particularly in this context. Bennett, you wrote this report for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. What does the Shared Space Under Pressure report that you wrote with them, business support for civic freedoms as well as for human rights defender, and what's the essential connection between the two? If you could share sort of 3 or 4 core points that the report puts to companies as they decide whether and how to act in support of defenders and civic freedoms. And may I also request all the panelists to keep a tab on your time through the chat. We're sending you reminders if you're over time, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Harpreet, and it's a pleasure to join the session this morning in Southeast Asia, and a pleasure to follow Bill Anderson, who's been a leader on behalf of Adidas in these issues. Business and civil society really share, or at least I hope can understand that they should share, the same space, a common interest in rule of law, accountable governance, and basic civic freedoms, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression. Those are the lifebloods of civil society's ability to operate. And at the same time, those are the essential underpinnings of sustainable and profitable business and investment environments. And too seldom do we see business and civil society coming together around this shared space to defend it and to strengthen it. So I think it's absolutely critically important. Nothing is more important than to protect and defend human rights defenders, those under pressure and attack. It's also critically important for companies to support this basic shared space of civic freedoms on which human rights defenders and indeed all civil society depends. The Shared Space Under Pressure report puts forward a normative responsibility for companies to act on behalf of human rights defenders and civic freedoms in certain circumstances consistent with the UN guiding principles. And that normative responsibility will be further elaborated by the forthcoming guidance that my longtime friend and colleague, Anita Ramasastry, has been working on now for a couple of years. But basically, when companies cause or contribute to or linked to adverse impacts on human rights defenders, civic freedoms, they then have a normative responsibility to act to support human rights, civic freedoms, or human rights defenders. There may be other instances where there's not a direct cause or contributor linkage relationship, and therefore not necessarily a normative responsibility to act, but companies should then see a discretionary opportunity to consider whether they should engage. And that's where the business case comes in, and not just the business case, but a moral choice. And all these factors have to be taken into consideration along with consultations with human rights defenders, with civil society, other stakeholders, and of course, human rights due diligence and risk assessment, as has often already been emphasized. And also companies need to consider not just whether, but how to act. It's not always publicly. Sometimes it's privately behind the scenes. It's not always just one company on its own. Sometimes it's collectively with other companies and other stakeholders. And then finally, companies worry that there are risks of acting in ways that might put them into conflict with the host country governments of the countries where they operate. And some of those risks may indeed be real. Others, I think, are often exaggerated. But as important as it is for companies to consider the risks of action on behalf of civic freedoms and human rights, it's at least as important, I think more important in most circumstances, for companies to consider the risks of inaction. Inaction in terms of their relationships with local communities, civil society, global civil society, stakeholders, shareholders. And I think over the long term, most companies will find it much more difficult to manage the risks of inaction than the risks of action at a time when this shared space of rule of law, accountable governance, human rights, civic freedoms is under such tremendous pressure.
Sure. Thanks, Bennett. And I see a couple of comments from our technical colleagues that we're really running late on time. So if I may ask each of the next speaker to keep their responses to within 2 minutes, I think we'll be able to take some question and answers in there. Mary, I'm going to come back to you. And, as I said, the business and human rights momentum is strengthening in the region. We've just heard how the situation on ground hasn't changed much for defenders. What would you recommend governments and businesses to ensure that the defenders are not targeted to speak up for, for themselves and for the community's rights? And if you could please take just 2 minutes. Thank you.
Well, the first thing we need to stress is that governments are responsible for protecting human rights defenders and human rights. And companies are responsible for respecting the rights of their human rights defenders throughout all their supply chain. But I'd be saying that silencing human rights defenders isn't just wrong, and it isn't just against what many of them have signed up to do. It's a false economy. And they need to stop targeting human rights defenders because it's in their own interest to do so, echoing some of what was said. And the world will never be the same after this pandemic, and business and governments will have to re-examine their relationships with human rights and those who defend them. And they'll have to learn from those working on the climate crisis, on health rights, in the fight against corruption, on business and human rights, and a whole range of issues that directly connect us all. And they can't be using COVID as a smokescreen to push through legislation or further target human rights defenders. Because if those human rights defenders who were warning against the spread of COVID had been listened to months ago and not silenced, the world would be a much healthier place now, with far fewer lives and livelihoods lost. The business world wouldn't be collapsing the way it is now, and governments and business cannot afford in the future to ignore journalists, and from now on, scientists and health professional human rights defenders anymore. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping in time. Anita, what would be your recommendations for businesses to ensure defenders are protected and also provided the space to operate, but then also an enabling environment in the spaces that they operate? And I think you wanted to you've also mentioned in the beginning that you wanted to talk about the judicial mechanisms in here. If you could also throw some light on that.
I think, we're hearing from defenders and we're hearing from others on this issue of enabling environment, and it really relates back to this issue of engagement. You heard from Bill and you heard from Bennett and others around communication, consultation. The guiding principles speak about this at the beginning, and seeing defenders in a different way as representatives and stakeholders who understand the local context very well and can be partners. That's the key thing in terms of what we need to do as a starting point. And from there, we will prevent many of the issues that we've been talking about today. I want to talk about SLAPP, though. We've heard from so many of the speakers today about this issue of using the judicial system, both criminally and civilly, to intimidate and really wreak havoc on the lives of defenders. I mean, there are many ways in which this happens. When a defender is subject to a judicial proceeding, this interrupts their lives in ways that we cannot even imagine for a very long period of time, and ultimately silences their freedom of expression more broadly. So what the working group has seen is we engage with judges, with court systems, with prosecutors in any number of jurisdictions, is that this issue of sort of technically thinking that there is a potential cause of action means that cases go forward that really should never have been brought. But if they are brought, we need mechanisms to ensure that there is screening by courts and by the judiciary to remove frivolous claims at the earliest start. So what we're seeing here is there could be a good law in the books that's meant to protect and prevent these lawsuits and these intimidations. But the real issue is that very often they're allowed to proceed. So we need many different things: judicial education of prosecutors, and mechanisms that really provide for sort of looking at any kind of case that is brought against a defender, to screen it and to sort of ask extra questions. The larger issue, I think, for many of the states that we visited is that piece isn't really happening. And I'll just say one last question, which is that are there examples of states and companies and defenders working together to sort of deal with risks to defenders? And I would say that examples are occurring, maybe not always at the national level, and Mary may have some other perspective on this, but we see municipalities and we see local governments working with defenders and with companies to develop emergency protocols when there is a threat. And so if we look at Colombia and we look at some other places, we will see models emerge, and I'm glad to see that.
Sure. Thanks, Anita. Cynthia, I'm going to move on next to you. We've heard contributions so far. They provide a clear illustration of the several challenges faced by the human rights defenders. What would you say are some of the concrete recommendations, particularly particularly to address them?
Thanks, Harpreet. Well, I think the most important thing is to say that effective measures for the protection, I go back to environmental human rights defenders, requires first and foremost action by governments. I think the deeply disconcerting statistics on violations against environmental human rights defenders in the region that we see year after year indicate that the principles are simply being disregarded. The guiding principles are clear that governments should ensure that environmental defenders are able to assume a central role in the preparation and monitoring of national action plans. And it's of particular importance to include defenders from rural and remote areas, as well as those individuals who face the greatest obstacles to participate in these processes. It is they who often are the most adversely affected by bad business practices and, of course, have the least access to protection. Turning to businesses, I think it's critical that obviously they comply with applicable environmental laws in all of their activities, but also publicly and in practice commit to honoring their human rights responsibilities through credible human rights due diligence processes. I'd like to emphasize, as was raised earlier, the importance of conducting sound and independent environmental impact assessments at the outset of any project. I think if it's conducted in a meaningful and participatory manner, these assessments are a critical vehicle to enable affected communities and environmental defenders to be heard and for their views to be included. Too often what we see with these environmental impact assessments is that they're conducted in a manner that is actually completely contrary to the spirit of the exercise, with the sole objective of pushing through the project. It's the responsibility of businesses to ensure safe and meaningful inclusive participation of all relevant stakeholders, and in particular vulnerable or disadvantaged groups, as well as making sure that women are able to be represented. And finally, a last word on the rights of Indigenous communities, because it is so important in this region. They are often, sadly, at the heart of the violations we see by businesses, particularly the extractive industries, large-scale development, and agribusiness. I mentioned this early, but the guiding principles call for free, prior, and informed consent in all phases of the planning. Because the impact on the Indigenous communities, on their land, their resources, and environment are profound. To ensure such consent, transparency, integrity, and vigilant oversight is required to have a process of due diligence that's meaningful and conforms to international standards. The onus is on businesses, and frankly, in my own work over the years, I have been deeply shocked and dismayed to see what is often, too often, an extremely poor excuse for consultation. Both businesses and governments must do better, and effective means to safely express their demands and concerns and influence decisions for Indigenous people is paramount to preserve their dignity and livelihoods, which are inextricably tied to a sound environment and land. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. And actually, I'm going to move on to Bill from here. Bill, I see a lot of questions, that are coming through your way. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions. But what should businesses that operate in countries, where governments consistently persecute, intimidate, or harass human rights defenders do? If you have any examples or experiences, from experience of Adidas operating in countries with closed or restricted civic space, I think that'd be really good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to kind of reflect a little bit on the COVID situation as well, how it's so fundamentally changing the operating conditions for everybody, I think negatively and potentially positively. I mean, in cases of, for example, Vietnam, where there's a restriction on freedom of association, yet in past years, we've seen a lot of mobilization of workers exercising rights, particularly over pay and benefits and other things. Even though you may not have the formal structures that you would hope for in terms of a freely operating trade union environment, you still have avenues, and government itself has moved progressively further towards allowing for that, say, within Vietnam. So I think conflict can be best resolved by engagement. That is the fundamental to everything that anyone perhaps on this forum would advise, you know. So and it is finding the right partners in that process. So I think in those places where there's a closed operating space, it is who you talk to, how do you capture the right partners that will take you to the place that's necessary for the change that you'd like to achieve. So, and again, just to reflect on the things that we're doing, we're actually reaching out to trade unions, given the limitations, the travel restrictions, and other things which our monitoring program is now has imposed upon it. We're actually reaching out to the trade union movements for an outside-in view of what's happening in our supplier factories. We want to hear from the community of people in the trade union movement. Is the factory fulfilling its safety requirements? Because we physically cannot visit in these times. So I think it's when you have a network and an engagement, it can be powerful and it can change things. So that's what I would say.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. So, Three, you know, we've heard about, you know, what businesses should do, what governments should do to protect defenders. But you know, we're also sort of looking at how should defenders safeguard themselves, and you know, particularly from cases like slaps, and what would be and what would be your additional recommendations to the businesses?
Okay, thank you for the question. As like many panelists has already mentioned, that the responsibility and the obligation lie with both state and the business themselves in order to comply with the human rights, labor right, and environmental standards. For the defender, I think like let's frame the question as like how we can actually work together to strengthen our effort and our work. And I think what would be good for us is also to mobilize and also to organize in terms of the finding the joint action and joint strategy in order to work together. And in addition to that, like there are several like organizations that providing resource and support for human rights activists and defender in order to support them in their work, and especially when they are meeting with the threats like the SLAPP lawsuit, for example. Like you can also like reaching out to the organization, for example, the International Federation of Human Rights or Protection International, that have this resource and also training for human rights defender. Coming to the recommendation for the business, I think like one of the first things that the business can do is also to publish the comprehensive information about their business operation and the supply chain, the shareholder, the employment policy, the condition, and also like what are involved in the supply chain. This is one of the very basic issue that I think can ensure transparency in your supply chain, and for others to be able to monitor and evaluate whether business are living up to the pledge or the commitment that they have. Like in addition to that, I believe that the business should also advocate for the policy in order to provide and also conduct the comprehensive human rights due diligence assessment in their supply chain. And most importantly is to adequately and effectively provide remedy for the abuse that they have already been engaged in the business activity. So that would be the recommendation for the business. Thank you.
Thank you, Considerably. Vora, I'm gonna come to you. You know, the other day that we were discussing, you also mentioned a couple of examples. I mean, I remember, you know, you did say that it really is difficult to find examples, you know, where businesses have taken up actions. But you were also mentioning a couple of examples, you know, where businesses have taken some initiatives. And if you could share some of your experiences of how do we engage with businesses, particularly in this context, and if there has been any examples from the region that you operate in.
Thanks, Harpreet. A lot of my experience may sound a little like confrontational when it comes to business engagement, because there are a number of cases that we have seen that the lack of information disclosure from the business, it's one of the fundamental root cause, and also the exclusion of impacted communities in the process of public participation and even stakeholder consultations. Sometimes it's just tokenistic and there's a lack of meaningful participation by the business. So these are some of the evidence and examples that I mentioned. One of my recommendations would be the two things. First of all, is the attempt to conduct human rights impact assessment at the very first stage of the project cycle. And through that process, there should be the level of transparency in terms of sharing information about the project impact, and also the effort to seek free prior informed consent from the indigenous communities, because most of the projects, development projects such as mining, hydropower that we see and witness in Southeast Asia context, they are mainly in the rural area, remote area, and sometimes belong to the indigenous land. And when the human rights defenders and indigenous rights defenders come out to speak and protect for their lands, they end up being abused and harassed by the business. One of the examples, I don't know if it's a good example yet, would be one of the policy on like zero tolerance to land grabbing. Through the engagement of civil society and NGO and even the communities who are impacted by the sugar plantation in Cambodia, through advocacy and campaigning approach, in the end, the two Soda Giant have adopted the zero tolerance to land grabbing policy. And this is all about voices from the impact communities are heard and negotiations are taking place, where the impact communities could place their demand, could place the condition that these are the preferred remedies that they want in terms of compensation to land grabbing. The opportunity like this may not happen much in other places in the region we have found, but there are a number of cases that I have engaged, and I think these are one of the good examples. The other example would be the trend in the financiers, such as the IFC, that adopted a policy like zero tolerance to retaliation. This is about the effort, the intention to protect human rights defenders, and this should be the good model that other business should draw from the region. Lastly, it's going to be a bit strange not talking about a national action plan of Thailand on business and human rights. There's such a huge effort on this, and thank you for all the great supporters, including those who support the civil society engagement in the process, such as the Swedish Embassy. And from our civil society perspective, I want to see actually the oversight body of this national action plan implementation. And from our like civil society side, we want this oversight of the implementation to be more actually to be monitored, and there are some check and balance in the sense that we could feed in the information that this business have carried out the process of human rights due diligence, but there are some gaps and weaknesses that we could identify in order to improve the process. So that would be concrete recommendation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bennett, I want you to sort of come in here, and when you were conducting research, when you were meeting people and interviewing people for your for the report that you published for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, did you find any specific examples, or if you could highlight any actions by individual companies or collectively by group of companies as sort of industry initiatives consistent with the shared space and the pressure framework in Southeast Asia or even elsewhere?
Oh, thank you very much, Harpreet. It's fascinating about Southeast Asia because there's tremendous pressure on the shared space of rule of law and accountable governance and civic freedoms and threats against human rights defenders. And yet at the same time, Southeast Asia is a region where there have been some very tangible, positive examples of both individual companies and groups of companies who have stepped forward. We highlighted in the report the example of Malaysian business leaders several years ago speaking out publicly on behalf of the Rohingya minority being persecuted in Myanmar. That was very encouraging. We've also seen in Cambodia a number of apparel brands, including Bill Anderson's company Adidas, but a number of others, including Levi Strauss and New Balance, and Gap, who together with the Fair Labor Association and the Ethical Trading Initiative spoke out publicly after first engaging privately with the government of Cambodia to support freedom of association and to really make the point that sourcing on such a large scale in that country was really unsustainable without greater respect for freedom of association. And more recently, even early this year, as a couple of our panelists know well, a number of Western agriculture companies and food brands, particularly based in the UK, supported labor law reform in Thailand pertaining to the seafood industry. And of course, I think most of us are aware of the work done by a number of local and international NGOs together with the investigator, Andy Hall, over the last 4 or 5 years, exposing abuses in the Thai seafood industry related to forced labor, and some international companies have supported his case. So there are these encouraging examples in Southeast Asia that I think are not only models for the region, but can be for the world. And I see other examples around the world as well, including in the US in recent weeks.
Thank you, Bennett. Ambassador, you've been engaged with the process, particularly in terms of the development of National Action Plan in Thailand, and you've had experience of, ensuring the voices of defenders and civil society organizations are brought in while developing the National Action Plan. What would be your recommendations for the governments who are in the process of developing National Action Plans, particularly in the context of, bringing in the voices? I mean, we've been listening, I think it's repeatedly, everybody sort of talked about the importance of engagement, importance of bringing the stakeholders, stakeholder to these conversations. What would be some of your recommendations? And if you could share some of the experiences that you've had.
Yeah, thank you. Normally, as ambassador, you're not really in the business of giving advice, but rather sharing of experiences. But let me, after 5 years and now 5 weeks before my departure from Bangkok, make an exception to that. So my advice to government developing national action plans would be, first of all, engage with human rights defenders, marginalized groups, affected communities during all steps, the various drafting steps, implementation and monitoring processes as well, as was mentioned by Vora recently. Listen and learn from their experiences, and listen in reality. I mean, I've been to Tilawa, I've been to Isan meeting CSOs, and you need to have the mindset of listening, not have a consultation that you were able to brand as a consultation and say, hey, now we can tick that box. You gain so much from moving to reality, to real human beings, rather than looking in papers, because the papers tell you one story, and then suddenly, as I remember from the Tilawa experiences, suddenly when you listen to people, you realize that the story is sometimes more nuanced, sometimes more complicated, sometimes dangerous, and you need to change your policy. Secondly, my advice to all governments would be protect the civic space and fundamental freedoms for people to speak out on issues of concern. Allow and encourage trade unions for everybody. Consider decriminalization of defamation. Put in place strong protective measures for human rights defenders and others to operate in this area we're dealing with, business of human rights. And when violations occur, take strong action. Take strong action against perpetrators so that there is no impunity, and so that there is timely justice, remedy, and redress for victims. Also in the cases of enforced, and not least in the cases of enforced disappearances. Amend your legislation in various aspects to stop continued slap cases, to strengthen access to justice for all. And if and when you have done that, make sure that such articles actually are used, not only there on paper. Engage all stakeholders, including businesses, including human rights defenders, national human rights institutions, judicial mechanisms in training, awareness raising, capacity building on the guiding principles. Simply walk the talk, simply defend the defenders.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you really did nail it, Singh. I think it's really important to sort of, walk the talk. I see a lot of questions in the Q&A boxes, and we'll not be able to address all the questions, but maybe, I'm going to pick up a few questions, and if each one of you could respond maybe in less than 1 minute, I think that'd be great. One of the questions that has repeatedly come, in the question and answers is about, we know that there are problems. We know that, we've talked about all the challenges that we're facing, but what are the solutions? Shall companies be made liable if someone is killed? Should licenses and permits be cancelled or suspended, if defenders are killed? Should investments be prohibited in the regions? Anita and Cynthia, if you can come in on these two, on this question, what should be done, on ground to really change the situation and to ensure that the defenders are defended?
Well, I look forward to Cynthia's answer. From the working group's perspective, we really need more solutions that involve both governments that have some kind of regulatory power and oversight and provide support to large companies that are engaging in business and who need to be as proactive as they can be on the ground. So that's one thing, which is to say, what is the role of these, what we call home governments, in terms of engaging on these issues? And it is so heartening to hear of Sweden's support and engagement on this activity. And I think we're seeing more of this from other states. We need more. And then again, we're hearing from the defenders. They've really given us many answers about what needs to be done in terms of engagement on impact assessments, on consultation, on issues relating to access to remedy. So it's about actually a commitment. And the guiding principles and what we call for is look at what respect for human rights means to a company and say, what does that mean to respect human rights defenders? Everything from having a policy statement and commitment, which Adidas, for example, has, to impact assessments and due diligence that looks at the risks to defenders, to grievance mechanisms and protections that really take into account the specific risks on the ground. So it's more about going beyond respect for human rights and going into a much more important analysis of respect for defenders. That's my key message today. And I look forward to really Cynthia's answers, because really that we should be listening, from the field and on the ground to defenders.
Thank you, Anita. I mean, you've said pretty much everything. I think there are two particular points. We have endless amounts of policy documents that, if truly implemented, would resolve a good amount of this on the ground. There are 2 points. It's about accountability and it's about impunity. And I think if governments, and this is where government's role is so critical, if governments, as Ambassador Stefan said, walk the talk, that means holding to account businesses that are violating human rights. If they do that on a routine basis and take measures to stop corruption, to stop impunity that is taking place within their own rank and file, I think we would be in a very, very different context where businesses could be checked if they are out of line in terms of what they're doing, but that we would see real respect for human rights within the actual spirit of the guiding principles. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Cynthia. I also see there are a couple of comments and there are a couple of questions that have come, particularly in the context of the specific challenges that the women human rights defenders face. And I'm just going to read it here. This is from Kunbi. She would like to ask the panelists about what we should and could do to create protection strategies to adapt to better accommodate and foster holistic strategy to community-based and grassroots women human rights defenders. Mary, if you want to come in, and perhaps Bill, if you want to come in here.
Sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
I'm just thinking about a case in Honduras. I don't know if you know about the murder of a Lenca woman, Berta Cáceres, who was involved in they were building a hydroelectric dam. And what happened in that case, I think was really interesting, because it showed how with enough international attention, national attention, progress could be made against the two very important things that Cynthia said: accountability and impunity. So after she was murdered, there was a huge national and outcry and international outcry. So there was an independent panel of investigators set up who reported and demonstrated the links between the company and the killing and the government. And as a result of that, people were charged. And the intellectual author is currently just, it's a situation where he is definitely probably going to be charged, but the others have been charged. But what was really interesting was also the development banks that were involved in funding the company's work, they pulled out. So the money was taken out. There was an independent investigation. The perpetrators were brought to justice. And for me, that was a real breakthrough, because that so rarely happens. So I don't really have much of an answer to what you're saying, to what you're asking. But I do think that you have to do a mapping, and you have to see where the entry points are. You have to see how you can advance this, the protection, in, as you say, in a holistic way. And you have to be very mindful of the exact environment and threats that the defender faces.
Harpreet, should I just add a few comments to that? I think one of the things that we're looking very closely at in our grievance mechanisms as a company, we look into the supply chain. We have a digital grievance mechanism that reaches 500,000 people. And those workers are 80% female. So there's a large number of females within the female workers within the supply chains, particularly in the apparel sector and footwear sector. And one of the things that we are paying particular attention to now is questions of violence and harassment, and how we can actually secure information to conduct proper investigations. So actually one of the biggest challenges, not so much the human rights defender trying to address an issue, it's actually trying to get visibility to the silent majority that may not raise concerns. So again, very much from our perspective, we're trying to build tools and mechanisms, build levels of trust, that there are ways of resolving things which, this is in terms of gender-based violence topics, more so than maybe the impact on women representing certain interests within a broader human rights context in the country. But, this is that you've got to build tools, effective tools that can capture. And then you've also got to build systems of trust and capability and expertise to support these things. So again, in this global gender-based violence space, that is a huge challenge. It needs the engagement with expertise with other NGOs that work in that space. So just as an example, this is something we're looking quite closely at.
Thank you, Bill. Mary, you brought in a very important point about the investors and the role that the investors can play. Vora, if you could come in and sort of talk about some of the experiences that you've had, particularly in the context of engaging with investors, and Anita, if you have any recommendations on particularly in the context of investors to protect defenders. Both of you 1 minute each. Vora, you want to start?
Okay, happy to share experience. I may sound a little bit confrontational again. Sorry to be frank and honest here in the approach that I think some of the business engagement from our civil society perspective, we have to be careful, because when we engage, it's about sometimes we send the perception that we accept the type of grievance mechanism that have already in place, for example, and we would like to find a space and platform to connect the impacted communities and the private sector. But in some of the case, we would like to stay away from that perception. So based on the NGO point of view, I think one of the way that we been engaging in the past is actually reviewing the investment policy of the company and identifying the gaps, whether or not they adopted, for example, the systems such as providing remedies, or whether or not they have implement the guiding principle in the sense that providing remedies and set up the mechanism and system that remedy can be sought from the impact community side. The other work that I think is a good example is we work with the communities to develop some kind of community-driven operational grievances mechanism where communities could identify that, look, this company A, your grievance mechanism, there are a number of gaps, and our demands are not actually fully addressed because of the existing operational grievance mechanisms. And from the community side, we have come up with a type of community-driven mechanisms where we could place demand in terms of fair and just compensation to our perspective. For example, the compensation of the bitternut farmland could be X amount of money, not just limited amount of $2 per tree in the context of the company evaluation, just the example. So I think this is one of my good examples that I come across so far from the NGO perspective.
Thanks, Vora. Anita, before you answer, let me just add another last question. We've really got just about less than 1 minute to wrap up. But when you also respond, can you also maybe reflect upon the role of international community in pushing the agenda? And if you could wrap up in literally 30 seconds, I would also request the ambassador to come in and sort of see how we can push the agenda through the international community. 30 seconds.
Yeah, so 10 seconds, and I think I'll just be quick to say that we've heard a little bit about international financial institutions and development finance, wherever there's capital. So financial institutions, international financial institutions, and then investors. All of these groups need to be sensitized and understand the risk to defenders. And right now, we haven't yet gotten there. We're starting, but that is a major point of leverage. And so for everybody, we need to work on these different entities.
Thank you, Anita. Ambassador.
Thank you. I think this is what we have been talking about is an illustration to the urgent need to defend the whole concept, the whole idea of cooperation, multilateral cooperation, international cooperation, dialogue between all stakeholders on the regional and global level. I'd hope that wouldn't be kind of an issue anymore, but we are living in times when multilateralism and the whole idea of cooperation and solidarity, but that idea is challenged. And we need to first of all, we need to win that fight. And I think what we are doing here together and also involving the private sector here has proven to be a very important tool to take the human rights agenda forward, also both in the sense of making economic development happen in a decent way, but also on a more general level, actually defending and protecting, promoting human rights according to all the ideals and all the great conventions we have on a global level. So back to my final message, we all need to walk the talk, and a good way to do that is to defend the defenders.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. Thank you, Mary, specifically for joining us at 5:30 in the morning and Bennett at 12:30 a.m. Anita, so late, but thank you. I think it's been really, really enriching conversation. Suturi and Vora, thank you for sharing your experiences, and Bill and Cynthia, thank you everyone. Thank you. Come on.